She should have died on that dusty trail, chained and broken behind a wagon wheel, forgotten like so many before her. But when he stepped from the pine forest, tomahawk in hand and justice burning in his dark eyes, fate took a different turn. They weren't supposed to meet, they weren't supposed to trust. But survival doesn't ask for permission when the chains cut deep. Every jagged rock on that endless Colorado trail carved something out of Marlena Moreau. Blood streaked her torn dress. Dirt filled her mouth, and the iron shackles around her ankles had rubbed her skin raw until bone showed white beneath the crimson. But the worst part wasn't the pain tearing through her body with every jolt of the wagon wheels. It was the laughter drifting back from the men who rode ahead. Casual and cruel, like they were discussing the weather instead of watching a human being slowly die.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wagon driver, Buck Torino, had stopped looking back hours ago. His thick shoulders hunched forward as he gripped the reins, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. Behind him in the wagon bed sat his employer, a thin man in expensive black suit who called himself Mr. Caldwell. Though Lena suspected that wasn't his real name, Caldwell's pale fingers drummed against a leather portfolio that contained maps, deeds, and documents that spelled out the destruction of everything Lena had spent 2 years trying to protect. Lena had stopped screaming somewhere past midday when her voice finally gave out, torn and bloody from the dust and her own desperate cries. Now her cracked lips moved in silent prayer to a God she'd long stopped believing would answer. Not because she thought he would save her, but because she didn't want to die alone with only hatred filling her heart. She'd been raised better than that. Even if these men hadn't, she couldn't say how many miles they'd dragged her since leaving Canyon Ridge at dawn. The Colorado sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the rocky trail into a furnace that baked the blood from her wounds into a dark crust. Her arms had gone numb hours ago, stretched behind her and bound with hemp rope that grew tighter with every mile. One shoulder felt wrong, dislocated maybe, sending lightning bolts of agony up her neck with every bounce and scrape. They'd taken her from the telegraph office just after sunrise, 3 days after she'd sent that final message to the territorial governor in Denver. She should have known Caldwell had men watching the wire, should have realized that her coded warnings about the illegal land seizures would never make it past the company's paid informants. But Lena had believed in the law, believed that evidence and truth could stand against money and corruption. She'd learned different as Buck's iron fist connected with her jaw, and the world went dark. When she'd awakened, she was already chained to the wagon's rear axle. The taste of blood thick in her mouth. Caldwell had leaned down close, his breath reeking of whiskey and decay, and explained her situation with the patient tone of a school teacher. "You were in the wrong place, darling," he'd whispered, his pale eyes reflecting nothing human. "And the wrong people took notice of your meddling. Some lessons need to be taught publicly." Lena wasn't even supposed to be important. She was just a telegraph operator who happened to speak 3 languages and could read legal documents. Just a woman trying to earn honest wages in a frontier town where honest work was getting harder to find. But she'd made the mistake of paying attention to the messages flowing through her office, made the mistake of recognizing patterns in the land acquisitions and mineral rights transfers, made the mistake of caring when families started disappearing from their homesteads. The Colorado Territory Land Development Company had been operating for 2 years, buying up abandoned properties for pennies on the dollar. Most folks assumed it was legal. Just sharp business practices taking advantage of failed farmers and unlucky miners. But Lena had seen the message traffic, had watched the careful coordination between company agents, corrupt territorial officials, and men who specialized in making problems disappear. It wasn't business, it was theft on a massive scale, backed by violence that never made it into any official reports. Buck had worked for the company for 3 years, and he was good at his job. His specialty was making examples, teaching lessons that other potential troublemakers would remember. He'd perfected the technique of dragging victims just far enough to cause maximum suffering without killing them too quickly. The chains left scars that served as permanent warnings. The screams carried on desert wind served as folktales that kept other curious souls from asking inconvenient questions. But today felt different to Buck, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the woman had stopped fighting after the first hour. Not from giving up, but from something deeper, a kind of quiet dignity that made him uncomfortable. Most of his victims begged, cursed, or went mad. This one had prayed, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. Buck Torino had given up on God 20 years ago when a Comanche raid left him scalped and half dead. But something about the woman's whispered words made his trigger finger itch. The trail wound upward now through stands of Colorado pine and aspen, heading toward the high country where abandoned mining camps dotted the landscape like forgotten graveyards. Caldwell's plan was simple, elegant, and completely untraceable. They would chain the telegraph operator to one of the old mine shafts, leave her with enough water to last maybe 2 days, and let the mountain take care of the rest. Come spring, if anyone found bones, they'd assume another foolish tenderfoot had gotten lost in the wilderness. Lena could feel her strength ebbing with each mile. Her body had moved beyond pain into a strange numbness that frightened her more than the agony had. She knew enough about frontier medicine to recognize the signs of severe blood loss, shock, and exposure. Her lips had turned blue despite the blazing sun, and her vision kept swimming in and out of focus. The chains around her ankles had cut so deep that her feet flopped uselessly, no longer responding to her attempts to protect herself from the worst rocks. The landscape around them had grown wilder, more remote. Towering pines cast long shadows across the trail, and the air carried the thin bite of high altitude. They hadn't seen another soul for hours, which was exactly what Caldwell wanted. Up here in the Colorado high country, a woman could disappear without a trace. The wilderness would swallow her screams, the weather would scatter her bones, and the company would continue its work without further interference. Buck's horse began to favor its left front hoof, stepping carefully around loose shale and granite boulders. The terrain was getting treacherous, and the smart thing would be to stop soon and finish their business before full dark. Mountain storms could blow in without warning this time of year, and getting caught in the open with lightning crackling overhead was a good way to get dead. Even Caldwell's money couldn't buy protection from a Colorado thunderstorm. That's when Buck heard it, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic beating of drums echoing off the canyon walls. Not the random noise of mining operations or construction work, but something older, more deliberate. The sound made the hair on his arms stand up, and his horse's ears swiveled nervously. Buck had spent enough time in Indian country to recognize war drums when he heard them. But this felt different, more personal somehow. Caldwell heard it too, his pale face growing even whiter as the drumming continued. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, his cultured voice cracking slightly. Buck didn't answer right away, listening carefully to the rhythm and trying to judge how far away it might be coming from. The sound seemed to bounce off every rock face, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It could be coming from anywhere in these maze-like canyons. "Dakota," Buck said finally, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "War party, maybe, or a hunting group. Either way, we don't want to meet them while we're dragging cargo." He gestured back toward Lena without looking at her, treating her like a piece of freight instead of a dying woman. Best to finish this quick and get moving. But even as he spoke, the drumming stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound had, oppressive and watching. Buck's horse dances sideways, nostrils flaring at scents he couldn't identify. The wind had shifted, carrying something new, something that made every instinct Buck possessed scream danger. In his experience, when Indians stopped making noise, that's when you started worrying. Lena heard the drums too, though they seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the haze of pain and blood loss that clouded her thoughts. She didn't know if they represented salvation or just another form of death, but anything would be better than what Caldwell and Buck had planned for her. The rhythmic beating reminded her of her father's heartbeat when she was small.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Strong and steady, and somehow comforting even in her current circumstances. Her father had been a trapper and trader who'd spent years working with various Indian tribes throughout the Colorado Territory. He'd taught her enough Dakota and Cheyenne phrases to conduct basic trade negotiations, though she doubted she could remember much of anything in her current state. Still, the drums stirred something deep in her memory, a half-remembered lullaby her father used to hum when thunderstorms kept her awake as a child. Buck urged his horse forward, eager now to reach the abandoned mining camp and complete their grisly task. The old Broken Creek mine lay just 2 miles ahead, a played-out gold claim with a shaft deep enough to hide a body permanently. The previous owner had died in a cave-in 3 years ago, and nobody had been fool enough to work the claim since. It was perfect for Caldwell's purposes, isolated and deadly, with a reputation that would keep curious prospectors away. The trail grew steeper as they climbed toward the mine, forcing Buck to slow the wagon and navigate carefully around washouts and fallen trees. Behind them, Lena's body continued its terrible journey across rock and dirt, leaving a crimson trail that would be visible to any tracker skilled enough to read sign. But Caldwell wasn't worried about trackers. Up here in the high lonesome, the only witnesses were eagles and pine trees. That's when they saw the smoke, thin gray wisps rising from somewhere ahead. Barely visible against the cloudy sky, Buck reined in his horse, squinting at the distant tree line. Smoke meant people, and people meant potential witnesses to their activities. Caldwell leaned forward in the wagon bed, his pale hands gripping the wooden sides until his knuckles went white. "What do you think?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Buck studied the smoke for a long moment, trying to judge its source and meaning. It was too steady to be a lightning strike, too controlled to be a wildfire. Someone had built that fire deliberately, and they built it in the exact direction Buck and Caldwell needed to travel. "Could be prospectors," he said finally. "Or it could be those drums we heard. Indians make camp same as anyone else. Can we go around?" Caldwell's voice carried a tremor of fear that Buck had never heard before. The thin man's usual arrogance had evaporated at the first sign of potential opposition, revealing the coward underneath the expensive suit. Buck almost smiled. It was always the same with these city men, tough as nails when dealing with helpless victims, scared as rabbits when faced with any real danger. Not without adding 6 hours to the trip, Buck replied. "And that puts us traveling in full dark, which ain't smart in this country. Too many cliffs and crevasses to stumble into. Better to push forward and see what we're dealing with. Might be nothing more than some old prospector cooking his supper." But Buck's instincts told him it was more than that. The drums, the smoke, the way his horse kept trying to turn around and head back down the trail. Everything pointed to trouble ahead. Still, Caldwell was paying him good money to handle problems, and Buck Torino had never backed down from a fight in his life. If some Indians wanted to interfere with company business, they'd learn the hard way what that kind of mistake cost. The sun was starting to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Long shadows stretched across the trail, and the temperature was beginning to drop with the coming darkness. Up in the high country, even summer nights could turn deadly cold, especially for someone who'd lost as much blood as the woman chained behind their wagon. Lena's consciousness drifted in and out like a tide, sometimes aware of the pain and terror of her situation, sometimes floating in a strange peaceful darkness where nothing hurt. During one of her lucid moments, she realized she could no longer feel her legs. The chains had cut off circulation hours ago, and now everything below her waist felt dead and distant. She wondered if that was how dying worked, piece by piece until nothing remained. The drumming started again, closer now and more insistent. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing off canyon walls and pine-covered slopes until the very air vibrated with rhythm. Buck's horse began to prance and snort, rolling its eyes at shadows that suddenly seemed to move independently of the wind. Something was definitely wrong, but it was too late to turn back now. That's when Mato Najin stepped out of the forest. He emerged from the pine shadows like a force of nature given human form, moving with the fluid grace of a mountain cat and the deadly purpose of a hunting wolf. Mato Najin stood 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories of battles won and honors earned. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers, and paint marked his high cheekbones in patterns that spoke of war and vengeance. But it was his eyes that stopped Buck Torino cold. Dark as winter nights and burning with a fury that seemed to reach directly into a man's soul. The Dakota warrior held a war tomahawk in his right hand, its steel blade gleaming with deadly sharpness, while his left rested on the grip of a bone-handled knife at his belt. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, just stood in the middle of the trail like an immovable force of judgment. His gaze moved from Buck to Caldwell and finally settled on the broken woman chained behind their wagon. What he saw there transformed his expression from controlled anger to something far more dangerous. Buck's hand instinctively moved toward his holstered Colt, but something in the warrior's stance warned him that any sudden movement would be his last. This wasn't some reservation Indian broken by government handouts and cheap whiskey. This was a fighting man in his prime, someone who had earned his place through skill and courage rather than bureaucratic appointment. Buck had seen enough warriors in his time to recognize the real thing when it stood before him. "Easy there, Chief," Buck said, trying to inject false confidence into his voice. "This here's company business, nothing that concerns you or your people. Just keep walking, and nobody gets hurt." The words sounded hollow even to Buck's own ears. And the warrior's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker. It was like talking to a mountain or trying to negotiate with a thunderstorm. Mato Najin had been tracking the wagon for 3 hours, following the blood trail and the distinctive marks left by dragging chains. He'd been hunting elk in the high meadows when the drums of his vision quest had called to him. Speaking of injustice and suffering that demanded action, the spirits didn't often speak so clearly, but when they did, a wise man listened. What he'd found at the end of that crimson trail had confirmed his worst suspicions about the white man's capacity for cruelty. The woman was barely alive, her dress torn to bloody rags, her body a map of cuts and bruises from hours of being dragged across unforgiving ground. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, even half closed with pain and exhaustion. They still held a spark of defiance that reminded him of his own sister, lost to smallpox 3 winters past. Here was someone who had refused to break, despite everything these animals had done to her. Caldwell finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Look, we can make a deal here. I've got money, gold coin, more than you've probably ever seen. Just turn around and forget you saw anything. Nobody has to know about this unfortunate incident." He reached slowly into his coat, pulling out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of precious metal. Mato Najin's response was to step forward, closing the distance by half. His movement was so smooth and controlled that it seemed almost like floating. Buck's horse began to dance nervously, sensing the predatory stillness that surrounded the warrior like an aura. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as 3 very different men faced each other on a narrow mountain trail, with death hanging in the air between them. The Dakota warrior spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the deep resonance of distant thunder. "You drag woman like dead buffalo. Shame her like animal. Bring shame to this sacred land with your cruelty." His English was accented but clear, each word chosen with careful precision. "The spirits have shown me what must be done." Buck decided to end this standoff the only way he knew how. His hand flashed toward his gun, fingers closing around the familiar grip of his Colt revolver. He was faster than most men who lived by violence in the Colorado Territory. But speed meant nothing when your opponent had already read your intentions and moved to counter them before you'd even started your draw. The tomahawk left, Mato Najin's hand in a glittering arc that seemed to bend the very air around it. Buck's gun was barely clear of its holster when the weapon took him in the center of his chest, the impact driving him backward off his horse to land heavily in the rocky dirt. His revolver discharged once into the sky before tumbling from Nerveless. Fingers and Buck Torino, who had terrorized innocent people for 3 years, found himself staring up at Colorado clouds while his life leaked away through a hole in his ribs. Caldwell screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that echoed off the canyon walls and sent a pair of ravens exploding from a nearby pine tree. He scrambled backward in the wagon bed, trying to put distance between himself and the warrior who had just killed his enforcer with casual efficiency. His expensive suit snagged on wooden splinters as he pressed himself against the wagon's back. Wall, pale hands trembling like autumn leaves, but Mato Najin wasn't finished. With Buck dying in the dirt, he turned his attention to the horses, speaking to them in soothing Dakota words. He calmed the frightened animals and took control of their reins. The horses responded to his voice and gentle touch, recognizing someone who understood their nature rather than simply using them as tools. Within moments, he had brought the wagon to a complete stop. The sudden cessation of movement was a mercy beyond words for Lena, who had been dragged behind the wagon for what felt like a lifetime of agony. The constant scraping and jarring stopped, and for the first time in hours, she wasn't being torn. Across rocky ground, the relief was so intense that tears began to flow down her dirt-streaked cheeks. Though whether from gratitude or simple physical response to the end of torture, she couldn't say. Mato Najin approached her carefully, moving slowly so as not to frighten her further. He could see the extent of her injuries, could read the story of her suffering in every cut and bruise. The chains had done terrible damage to her ankles, cutting through skin and muscle to scrape against bone. Her shoulders were dislocated from being dragged in an unnatural position, and blood loss had left her skin pale as winter snow. "Be still, sister," he said softly, kneeling beside her broken form. "The hurting will end now. I am Mato Najin, of the Lakota people, and I give you my word that no more harm will come to you while I draw breath." His voice carried a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who had just killed a man with such casual violence. But Lena heard the truth in his words and felt something inside her chest unknot for the first time since her ordeal began. He examined the chains binding her ankles, running experienced fingers over the iron links and the crude padlock that held them closed. These were heavy shackles, designed for long-term imprisonment rather than temporary restraint. Someone had planned this torture with deliberate care, intending to cause maximum suffering over an extended period. The realization filled him with a cold rage that burned like winter fire in his belly. From his medicine bag, Mato Najin produced a set of slender steel picks, tools he'd learned to use during his time as a scout for the cavalry before he'd discovered their true nature and turned his back on their world. The lock was crude but solid, designed by men who never expected anyone to challenge their authority. It took him several minutes of patient work, but eventually the mechanism clicked open and the chains fell away from Lena's ravaged ankles. The sudden absence of the chain's weight was another shock to her system, and Lena gasped as circulation began to return to her feet. The pain was excruciating as blood flow resumed. But it was honest pain, the pain of healing rather than destruction. She tried to speak, to thank the man who had saved her life, but her throat was too dry and damaged to produce more than a hoarse whisper. Mato Najin lifted her as gently as if she were made of spun glass, cradling her against his chest while being careful not to put pressure on her obvious injuries. She weighed almost nothing, having lost significant body mass during her ordeal, and he could feel the heat of fever beginning to burn through her skin. Infection was setting in from her numerous wounds, and without proper treatment, she would die anyway, just more slowly and with less obvious violence. He carried her to A spot beneath a large pine tree where the ground was soft with fallen needles, laying her down with infinite care before covering her with his own blanket. The fabric was woven from buffalo wool and decorated with geometric patterns that told the story of his family's hunting prowess. It was warm and clean, smelling of sage smoke and mountain air rather than blood and suffering. Caldwell had been watching this rescue with growing panic, realizing that his carefully planned operation was falling apart around him. With Buck dead and the woman freed from her chains, there were now witnesses to testify about the company's methods. His reputation, his business, his entire future hung in the balance. Unless he could find a way to eliminate these new problems. "You don't understand what you're doing," Caldwell called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "That woman is a criminal, a saboteur who was trying to destroy legitimate business operations. She was being transported to face proper justice. You've interfered with official company business." The lies came easily, polished by years of practice at twisting truth to serve his purposes. Matonasian didn't even look at him. Instead, he began gathering materials for a proper healing fire. Collecting dry wood and tinder while keeping one eye on his patient. Lena's breathing was shallow and rapid, her pulse thready and weak. She had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and shock was setting in as her body tried to cope with the trauma. Without immediate medical attention, she wouldn't live to see another sunrise. From his medicine bundle, the Dakota warrior produced packets of herbs wrapped in soft leather, plants his grandmother had taught him to identify and use, remedies that had sustained his people through countless generations of hardship. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, golden seal to stop bleeding, and other medicines whose names existed only in the old language. He built his fire with the reverence his grandfather had taught him, understanding that flame was a sacred gift that could bring either destruction or healing depending on how it was used. The smoke rose straight and clean in the still mountain air, carrying prayers and intentions up to the spirit world where ancestors watched over their descendants with eternal vigilance. The first priority was stopping the bleeding. From her worst wounds, the chains had cut deep grooves around her ankles, and road rash covered most of her back and arms, where she'd been dragged across rocky ground. Matonasian worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning each injury with boiled water before applying herbal poultices that would fight infection and promote healing. Lena drifted in and out of consciousness as he worked, sometimes aware of gentle hands tending her wounds, sometimes floating in fevered dreams where she relived the horror of being chained behind Buck's wagon. But even in her delirium, she could sense the difference between her current situation and her recent torment. These hands healed rather than hurt. This voice soothed rather than threatened. As darkness fell across the Colorado high country, Matonasian built up his fire and settled in for a long night of watching over his patient. He positioned himself where he could see both the injured woman and keep an eye on Caldwell, who remained huddled in the wagon like a cornered rat. The company man hadn't tried to run yet, probably because he knew he wouldn't survive a night alone in these mountains without proper gear or wilderness experience. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, and Matonasian added another blanket over Lena's shivering form. He'd seen enough battle wounds to know that the next few hours would determine whether she lived or died. Her body was fighting shock, blood loss, infection, and exposure all at the same time. Even with proper medical treatment, her survival would depend on inner strength that couldn't be measured by any white man's medicine. But there was something about this woman that reminded him of the warriors he'd known, men and women who refused to surrender even when death seemed certain. She had endured hours of unimaginable torture without breaking, had maintained her dignity in the face of cruelty that would have destroyed lesser souls. If anyone could survive what had been done to her, it was someone with that kind of inner fire. Caldwell made his move just before midnight, when exhaustion and emotional strain had taken their toll on everyone's alertness. He slipped quietly from the wagon bed, moving carefully to avoid making noise on the rocky ground. His plan was simple: get to Buck's horse, retrieve the dead man's rifle, and eliminate both witnesses before they could cause him any more trouble. But Mato Najin had been expecting something like this. In his world, wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and Caldwell was definitely wounded, trapped, and desperate enough to try anything. The warrior's hand closed around his knife handle as he tracked the company man's movements through peripheral vision, ready to end this threat permanently if necessary. "I wouldn't," Mato Najin said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the small campsite. Caldwell froze halfway. To Buck's corpse. Realizing that his movements had been observed and anticipated. "The woman needs rest. Your noise disturbs her healing. Return to the wagon and be still. Or join your friend in whatever afterlife awaits men like you." The quiet menace in that voice was more effective than any shouted threat. Caldwell could hear death waiting behind the warrior's calm words, could sense that this was someone who would kill without hesitation if pushed too far. He retreated to the wagon, pulling his knees up to his chest like a frightened child. All his money and influence meant nothing out here in the wilderness, where only strength and skill determined who lived and who died. Dawn came slowly too. The high country, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the darkness they'd all endured. Lena's fever had broken sometime during the night, and though she was still desperately weak, her breathing had deepened and her pulse had grown stronger. The herbs and careful nursing had pulled her back from the brink of death. Though the road to full recovery would be long and difficult, she opened her eyes as the first sunlight touched her face, blinking in confusion at the sight of pine boughs overhead instead of the endless Colorado sky she'd grown accustomed to during her ordeal. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory flooded back, bringing with it the echo of pain and the vivid recollection of being rescued by a warrior who seemed more legend than man. Mato Najin knew they couldn't stay exposed on the mountain trail much longer. Word of Buck's death would spread once someone found the body, and Caldwell's company had resources that reached into every corner of the Colorado Territory. Corrupt lawmen, hired guns, and politicians who asked no questions as long as the bribes kept flowing. The warrior had bought them time, but time was a commodity that would run out faster than water in a desert. Lena struggled to sit up despite the fire that shot through her damaged ribs, her gray eyes focusing on the man who had saved her life. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice still raw from screaming and dust. "Why did you help me?" The question came from a place deeper than curiosity. She needed to understand what kind of man would risk everything for a complete stranger. "I am Mato Najin, which means bear standing in your language," he replied while packing his medicine bundle with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother taught me that the spirits sometimes send visions to guide us toward our true purpose. 3 nights ago, I dreamed of a woman in chains whose suffering would bring great change to this land. The dream showed me following a trail of blood to find either death or destiny." He helped her drink from a water skin filled with mountain spring water that tasted cleaner and colder than anything she'd experienced in months of frontier living. Each swallow seemed to wash away a little more of the dust and despair that had accumulated during her ordeal. Her throat still felt raw, but speech was becoming easier. "I'm Marlena Moreau, but everyone calls me Lena. I work for the telegraph office in Canyon Ridge. Or I did until they decided I knew too much about their business." Caldwell stirred in the wagon bed, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat and fear. "You're both making a terrible mistake," he called out, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there before Buck's death. "The Colorado Territory Land Development Company has legal authority to conduct business in these mountains. What you've done here is murder and kidnapping, crimes that carry the death penalty." Mato Najin looked at the company man with the same expression he might reserve for a rattlesnake that had crawled into his lodge. "Your law means nothing in the high places where my ancestors walked," he said calmly. "Here, the only justice comes from the spirits and the strength of a man's heart." Your hired killer is dead because he chose violence. You live because you have information we need. The warrior began preparing for travel, gathering supplies and checking equipment with the methodical care of someone who had spent his entire life in wilderness settings. He fashioned a travois from pine saplings and buffalo hide, creating a smooth platform that would allow Lena to travel without walking on her damaged ankles. The construction was both elegant and practical, using traditional techniques that had served his people for countless generations. Lena watched him work with growing amazement. Every movement was precise and purposeful, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes. This was a man who had learned to live in harmony with a harsh environment rather than fighting against it. "Where are we going?" she asked as he secured the travois to his horse with rawhide ropes. "To the sacred valley where my grandfather's bones rest," Mato Nazin replied. "It is a place where the old ways are still strong, where healing comes from the earth itself, rather than from white man's medicine. My people have sheltered there since before the first soldiers came to steal our land. You will be safe while your body mends and your spirit finds its strength again." The idea of safety seemed almost foreign to Lena after everything she'd endured. For months, she'd been living with the constant fear that her investigation would be discovered, jumping at every unexpected sound, sleeping with a loaded derringer under her pillow. Now this stranger was offering her sanctuary in a place she'd never heard of, protected by people who owed her nothing. They departed the blood-soaked campsite just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, painting the Colorado high country in shades of gold and amber that made the previous night's violence seem like a fever dream. Mato Najin had tied Caldwell's hands and fashioned a lead rope to keep him close. The company man would accompany them whether he liked it or not. His knowledge of the land development conspiracy was too valuable to leave behind. The trail they followed was ancient, worn by generations of Dakota hunting parties who had used these mountains as summer grounds long before European settlers arrived. It wound through stands of aspen and pine, following natural contours that avoided the steepest grades while maintaining steady progress toward their destination. Lena rode the travois in relative comfort, amazed at how smoothly it moved across terrain that would have been agony to traverse on foot. As they traveled, Mato Najin began to share stories about the land they were crossing, pointing out landmarks that held special significance in his people's oral history. "That peak is called Wakanyanoi, Thunder Nest, because the spirits go there to make storms," he explained, indicating a jagged summit wrapped in perpetual clouds. "And that valley was where my great-grandfather received his vision quest. 4 days without food or water until the bear spirit came to give him his name." Lena found herself drawn into these tales despite her pain and exhaustion. They painted a picture of a world where every rock and tree held meaning, where the landscape itself was alive with stories and spiritual significance. It was so different from the white settlers' view of the wilderness as something to be conquered and exploited, rather than understood and respected. Caldwell, trudging along behind the horse with his hands bound and his dignity in tatters, tried several times to interrupt with complaints about his treatment and demands to be released. Each time, Mato Najin would simply increase the pace slightly, forcing the soft company man to focus on keeping up rather than running his mouth. After the third such incident, Caldwell fell silent and concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. By midday they had climbed high enough that the air began to thin noticeably, and patches of snow appeared in shaded areas despite the summer season. The landscape grew increasingly dramatic, with towering granite spires and deep canyons that seemed to drop away into blue infinity. This was country that could kill an unprepared traveler in a dozen different ways. Yet Mato Najin navigated it with the confidence of someone following a well-worn path through his own backyard. They stopped to rest beside a mountain stream where crystal-clear water tumbled over smooth stones in a series of natural pools. Mato Najin helped Lena drink and checked her bandages while their horses grazed on sweet mountain grass. The herbal poultices he'd applied during the night had drawn out much of the infection from her wounds, and the constant pain that had been her companion since the ordeal began was finally starting to subside. "Tell me about this conspiracy," Mato-Najin said as he refilled their water skins. "What did you discover that made them want to silence you permanently?" His question was casual, but Lena could hear the underlying steel in his voice. This was a man who understood that information could be just as dangerous as any weapon. Lena gathered her thoughts, trying to organize months of investigation into a coherent narrative. "It started with the telegraph messages I was sending and receiving," she began. "I noticed patterns in the land acquisitions. Properties being declared abandoned when families were still living on them. Mineral rights being transferred to shell companies that didn't seem to exist. Official surveys that contradicted what local people knew about their own land." She paused to take another sip of water, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I began copying the messages and cross-referencing them with county records and newspaper reports. What I found was systematic fraud on a massive scale. The Colorado Territory Land Development Company was working with corrupt territorial officials to steal land from legitimate owners, then selling the mineral and timber rights to Eastern investors who had no idea they were buying stolen property." Caldwell's face had gone pale during this recitation, and sweat began beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he said desperately. "The territory needs development, needs capital investment. To grow and prosper, sometimes individuals have to sacrifice for the greater good of progress and civilization." Mato-Najin's response was to draw his knife and begin cleaning his fingernails with the razor-sharp blade, a casual gesture somehow more menacing than any direct threat. "Your civilization has a strange way of bringing prosperity," he observed. "First you steal the land from those who lived on it for generations. Then you steal it again from your own people. Perhaps the problem is not with the land, but with those who claim to own it." The afternoon brought them to the edge of a vast canyon system that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Red sandstone walls dropped away into purple shadows, and ancient petroglyphs marked the cliff faces with symbols that predated written history. This was sacred ground, a place where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Lena could feel the power of it even in her weakened state. "The valley lies below," Mato-Najin announced, pointing toward a narrow trail that switched back down the canyon wall. "It has been hidden from white eyes for 50 years, protected by terrain that kills the unwary and spirits that turn away those with evil intentions. Your Mr. Caldwell will be the first of his kind to see it, an honor he has not earned, but which circumstances require." The descent was treacherous, requiring all of Mato-Najin's skill to guide the horse and travois safely down the narrow path. In some places, the trail was barely wide enough for a single traveler, with sheer drops of hundreds of feet waiting for anyone who made a careless step. Caldwell, forced to navigate the path on foot with his hands bound, quickly developed a healthy respect for the mountain's deadly potential. As they descended, the canyon walls began to reveal their secrets. Hidden caves marked ancient campsites, while natural springs created oases of green vegetation in an otherwise stark landscape. Here and there, Lena caught glimpses of more petroglyphs, images of hunters and animals and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. "My people called this place Maka Waste, good earth," Mato-Najin explained as they reached the canyon floor. "The spirits here are old and strong, older than the mountains themselves. They have watched empires rise and fall, seen the buffalo herds that once darkened the plains, witnessed the coming of the horse and the gun and the railroad. Through it all, they have protected this valley from those who would defile it." The valley that opened before them was like something from a fever dream. Lush grassland stretched between towering walls of red stone, nourished by springs that never failed even in the driest years. A river wound through the center of the valley, its waters so clear that fish could be seen swimming in its depths from 100 yards away. This was paradise hidden in the heart of a harsh land. But it was the people who caught Lena's attention. A small band of Dakota had made their homes here, living in traditional lodges and following the old ways, despite the pressures of the modern world. Men tended horses while women worked with leather and beads. Children played games that their great-grandparents had learned centuries ago. This was a living piece of history, a fragment of the world that had existed before European contact. An elderly woman emerged from the largest lodge, her silver hair braided with shells and feathers, her weathered face marked with the wisdom of many winters. She studied the newcomers with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the spirit beneath. When her gaze settled on Lena, something in her expression softened with what might have been recognition. "Grandmother," Mato Najin said formally, dismounting and approaching the elder with obvious respect. "I have brought the woman from my vision, the one whose chains were forged by greed but broken by justice. She carries wounds in her body and scars on her spirit, but also knowledge that may help us protect our people from those who would steal the earth itself." The old woman nodded slowly, then spoke in rapid Dakota that Lena couldn't follow, though she caught her own name mentioned several times. Mato Najin replied in the same language, his tone respectful but urgent, indicating Caldwell with obvious distaste. The conversation continued for several minutes while the rest of the band gathered to observe the unusual visitors. "Grandmother Winona says you are welcome here," Mato Najin translated finally. "She also says the spirits told her you would come, though they did not reveal when or in what condition. She has prepared medicines and ceremonies to heal both your body and your heart, but first you must rest and regain your strength." Lena felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Not from pain but from overwhelming gratitude. After months of fear and isolation, weeks of investigation that put her life at risk, and hours of unimaginable torture, she had finally found sanctuary among people who understood suffering and offered healing without asking for anything in return. They helped her from the travois and into a small lodge that had been prepared with soft furs and a healing fire. The smoke carried the scent of sage and cedar, herbs that were said to drive away evil spirits and promote recovery. Outside, she could hear the quiet sounds of daily life continuing in the hidden valley. Children laughing, horses nickering, adults speaking in low voices that carried the rhythm of an ancient language. As darkness fell over the sacred valley, Lena finally allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive her ordeal. More than that, she began to hope that justice might be possible, that the truth she had risked everything to preserve could finally be brought to light, with Mato Najin as her protector and the hidden band as her sanctuary. Perhaps the Colorado Territory Land Development Company's reign of terror was coming to an end. But first, she had to heal, had to regain her strength and prepare for the battles that lay ahead, because men like Caldwell didn't give up easily. And the forces arrayed against them had resources and connections that reached far beyond the boundaries of any hidden valley. The real fight was just beginning. 3 weeks in the hidden valley had transformed Lena from a broken woman into something harder and more dangerous. Under Grandmother Winona's care, her physical wounds had healed remarkably well, leaving only thin white scars as reminders of her ordeal. But the changes went deeper than flesh and bone. Daily training with Dakota warriors had taught her to move silently through tall grass, to read tracks in muddy ground, and to throw a knife with deadly accuracy at 20 paces. She was becoming someone Buck Torino wouldn't have recognized. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold as Lena practiced with her new weapon, a beautifully crafted tomahawk that Mato Najin had presented to her after she'd completed her first successful hunt. The weight of it felt natural in her hands now, balanced and deadly, an extension of her will rather than just a tool. Her throws were finding their mark with increasing consistency, splitting wood targets and burying the blade deep in pine trunks. Caldwell had spent those same 3 weeks as a reluctant guest of the Dakota band, his hands unbound but his movements carefully watched by warriors who understood that desperate Men sometimes chose death over captivity. To his credit, the company man had adapted better than expected to life without servants and luxury, though his expensive suit had long since been replaced with practical buckskin clothing that wouldn't snag on thorns or tear on rough stone. What surprised everyone was how much information Caldwell possessed about the land development conspiracy. Under patient questioning from Grandmother Winona, who had a gift for extracting truth from unwilling sources, he'd revealed details that went far beyond what Lena had discovered through her telegraph intercepts. The corruption reached into the territorial legislature, federal land offices, and mining consortiums that operated across multiple states. "You have to understand," Caldwell had explained during one of his more cooperative moments, "this wasn't just about stealing land from farmers and Indians. We were creating an entire economic system based on false documentation and manufactured legal precedents. Every deed, every survey, every mineral rights transfer was designed to concentrate ownership in the hands of a few Eastern investors who never even saw the territory." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving hundreds of officials and thousands of illegal transactions spanning nearly a decade. Families had been driven from their homes. Native American treaty lands had been seized through fabricated paperwork, and legitimate mining claims had been transferred to shell companies that existed only on paper. The total value of stolen assets reached into the millions of dollars. But it was the human cost that truly horrified Lena. Caldwell's records, hidden in a secret compartment of his traveling case, documented systematic violence against anyone who threatened to expose the scheme. Buck Torino had been only one of dozens of enforcers who specialized in making problems disappear. The lucky victims had simply vanished into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The unlucky ones had been made into examples, their suffering designed to terrorize others into silence. Mato Najin spent his days scouting the canyon approaches, watching for signs that the outside world had discovered their hidden refuge. His network of contacts among various tribes had brought disturbing news. Company agents were asking questions in trading posts and settlements throughout the territory, offering substantial rewards for information about a missing executive and his hired gun. The hunt for Caldwell was intensifying. "They're getting desperate," he reported during a council meeting in Grandmother Winona's lodge. "3 different search parties have been seen in the high country, all well armed and led by professional trackers. Someone with real authority has decided that finding Caldwell is worth serious money and effort. That means our secret won't stay secret much longer." The old woman had been expecting this development in her dreams. She'd seen riders approaching through the mountain passes, men with cold eyes and colder hearts who would show no mercy to anyone who stood in their way. "The time for hiding is ending," she announced with the quiet authority of someone who had guided her people through decades of crisis. "Now we must decide whether to fight or fade into the deeper wilderness. Like smoke on the wind." Lena stood up from where she'd been sitting beside the fire, her hand instinctively checking the tomahawk at her belt. "I won't run anymore," she declared, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there when Mato Najin first found her chained behind Caldwell's wagon. "These men destroyed my life, terrorized my community, and turned the law into their personal weapon. Running just gives them permission to keep hurting innocent people." The warriors nodded approvingly at her words, recognizing the same fire that burned in their own hearts when faced with injustice. But Grandmother Winona studied Lena with ancient eyes that had seen too much violence and too many young people destroyed by their desire for vengeance. "Fighting and dying are not the same thing, child," she said gently. "Courage without wisdom leads only to glorious graves." That night, alone in her lodge with only the crackling fire for company, Lena made a decision that would change everything. Using supplies she'd gathered over the past week, she began copying Caldwell's records onto paper that could survive rough travel, creating multiple sets of documents that told the complete story of the land development conspiracy. If something happened to her, if the company's killers found their hidden valley, at least the truth would survive. She worked through the night by firelight, her hand cramping from hours of careful writing, but driven by the knowledge that these papers represented the only real weapon they possessed against their enemies. Physical courage and warrior skills meant nothing if the powerful men behind the conspiracy could simply disappear into the shadows and start over somewhere else. Only exposure, only the harsh light of public scrutiny, could truly destroy them. Dawn brought a messenger, a young Dakota scout who had ridden hard through the night with news that chilled everyone who heard it. "Soldiers," he gasped, still breathing hard from his desperate journey. 2 companies of cavalry, maybe 60 men, camped at Bitter Creek with orders to search every canyon and valley in the territory. They have a federal warrant signed by a territorial judge, claiming authority to arrest dangerous fugitives. The implications were clear to everyone in the council lodge. Someone with serious political connections had decided that finding Caldwell was worth deploying military forces. The company's influence reached all the way to territorial headquarters, probably to Washington itself. This wasn't just about recovering a missing executive anymore. It was about preventing exposure of corruption that could topple governments and destroy careers. Mato Najin's face darkened with anger as he processed this information. He'd served as a scout for the cavalry before learning their true nature. Had seen how easily officers could be bought with promises of promotion and comfortable assignments. "They'll claim we're hostiles," he said grimly. "Dangerous Indians holding white captives. The newspapers will print whatever story serves their purposes, and by the time anyone learns the truth, we'll all be dead or in chains." Caldwell, who had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm, finally found his voice. "You don't understand what you're up against," he said desperately. "The people I work for have connections you can't imagine. Senators, judges, generals, men who can make entire cavalry regiments disappear from official records if necessary. Your only chance is to let me go. Let me negotiate some kind of settlement that protects everyone." Grandmother Winona's response was to laugh, a sound like wind chimes made of human bone. "You still think this is about money and power," she said, shaking her head at his blindness. "You still don't understand that some things cannot be bought or negotiated away. Justice is not a commodity to be traded in your markets of corruption." The debate that followed lasted hours, with passionate arguments from warriors who wanted to fight, elders who counseled retreat, and younger band members who suggested various compromise solutions. But through it all, Lena remained silent, her mind working through possibilities and consequences, while her fingers traced the outline of the COPID documents hidden in her medicine bag. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith and the discussion began to circle back to points already covered multiple times, Lena stood and raised her hand for silence. When the lodge grew quiet, she spoke with a clarity and conviction that surprised even herself. "We're approaching this wrong," she announced. "We're thinking like people who have something to lose, when actually we have everything to gain." She moved to the center of the lodge, where the fire cast dancing shadows on her determined face. "The cavalry is coming because Caldwell's people are desperate. They're making mistakes, using official resources for private business, creating records and witnesses that can be used against them later. Instead of running from that attention, we should be directing it toward the truth." Mato Najin leaned forward, intrigued by the direction of her thoughts. "What do you mean?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to understand her strategy. This woman had been transformed by her ordeal, forged into someone who thought like a warrior but fought like a strategist. "I mean, we make sure those 60 cavalrymen find exactly what we want them to find," Lena replied, pulling the COPID documents from her medicine bag and spreading them on the ground where everyone could see them. "We turn Caldwell's rescue into his exposure. Make his salvation into his destruction. Let the cavalry come. Let them find us. Let them hear the whole truth about what their government has been protecting." The idea was audacious, dangerous, and completely contrary to every survival instinct that had kept the hidden band safe for decades. But it was also brilliant in its simplicity. using the enemy's strength against them by turning a manhunt into a public revelation. If they could control the circumstances of contact with the cavalry, if they could make sure the right information reached the right people, the conspiracy that had seemed so powerful might collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Caldwell's face had gone ashen as he realized what Lena was proposing. "You're insane," he whispered. "Even if some of the soldiers believe you, even if some of the evidence reaches honest officials, there are too many people with too much to lose. They'll find ways to discredit anything you say, to make you disappear along with your precious documents." But Grandmother Winona was nodding slowly, her ancient eyes bright with something that might have been approval. "The young woman has learned wisdom in her suffering," she said. "Sometimes the only way to defeat an enemy is to force them to reveal themselves in daylight, where their true nature cannot be hidden. The spirits have been preparing us for this moment, though we did not recognize it until now." The final decision came to a vote, conducted in the traditional Dakota manner, with each adult member of the band expressing their choice through the placement of a painted stick in one of two baskets. When the counting was finished, the result was closer than expected, but clear enough. They would stay, they would prepare, and when the cavalry arrived, they would be ready with the truth that afternoon. As preparations began for what everyone understood might be their last stand, Lena found herself standing at the edge of the river that ran through the heart of the valley. The water was so clear she could see fish swimming lazily in the depths, oblivious to the human dramas playing out on the banks above them. It occurred to her that this might be the last peaceful moment she would ever experience. Mato Najin approached quietly, his moccasined feet making no sound on the soft grass. "Are you afraid?" he asked, settling beside her on a flat stone that overlooked the water. It wasn't a challenge or an attempt to shame her, just an honest question from someone who understood that courage and fear were often inseparable companions. "Terrified," Lena admitted, surprised by how easy it was to be honest with this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. "But not of dying, exactly. I'm afraid of failing. Of letting all those families who were cheated and murdered be forgotten. Of allowing men like Caldwell to win simply because they have more money and better connections than their victims." He nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility she carried. "My grandfather used to say that the spirits choose their warriors not for their fearlessness, but for their willingness to act despite their fear," he said. "What matters is not whether we are afraid, but what we do with that fear, whether we let it paralyze us or use it to sharpen our focus." As evening fell over the hidden valley, the Dakota band made their final preparations for the confrontation that was coming. Weapons were checked and cleaned, medicine bundles were prepared for the wounded, and prayers were offered to ancestors who had faced similar challenges in generations past. Everyone understood that the next few days would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of countless innocent people throughout the territory. The last light of day painted the canyon walls in shades of red that reminded Lena of blood, an omen that seemed appropriate given what lay ahead. Tomorrow the cavalry would arrive. Tomorrow the truth would finally be told, and tomorrow the real battle for justice would begin in earnest. She touched the tomahawk at her belt one more time, then headed back to her lodge to spend what might be her final night in the hidden valley that had become her sanctuary. The cavalry arrived at dawn on the fourth day, 60 men in blue uniforms riding in perfect formation down the ancient trail that led to the sacred valley. At their head rode Major William Harrington, a career officer whose weathered face showed the strain of 30 years fighting Indians, outlaws and political corruption in equal measure. Behind him came 2 companies of seasoned soldiers, men who had survived the Apache Wars and the last of the great buffalo hunts, all of them wondering why they were chasing missing businessmen. Instead of hostile war parties, Captain James Morrison rode beside the major, a younger man whose pristine uniform and soft hands marked him as someone more familiar with staff meetings than battlefield commands. He carried sealed orders from territorial headquarters, Papers that authorized the use of military force to recover federal property and apprehend dangerous fugitives who had allegedly murdered company agents and kidnapped a prominent businessman. The official story was clean, simple, and completely fabricated. But Major Harrington had been a soldier too long to accept official stories without question. Something about this mission felt wrong from the beginning. The urgency that bypassed normal channels, the involvement of civilian interests in what should have been military business, the curious lack of specifics about exactly what crimes had been committed by whom. In his experience, when politicians and businessmen started giving soldiers vague orders, innocent people usually ended up dead. The hidden valley spread before them like something from a fever dream. Impossible green grass surrounded by towering red walls that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. A crystal clear river wound through the center of the basin, reflecting morning sunlight in patterns that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful beyond description, and it was obviously inhabited by people who had been living here undisturbed for longer than the United States had existed as a nation. What stopped the Major cold was not the natural beauty of the place, but the sight of a white woman standing calmly in the center of the Dakota camp, her hands empty, but her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came only from someone who had nothing left to lose. She wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and a tomahawk hung at her belt with the casual familiarity of a tool rather than an ornament. This was not what anyone had expected to find. Lena had positioned herself exactly where she wanted to be, close enough to the soldiers to be clearly visible, but far enough from the Dakota lodges to avoid immediate crossfire if shooting started. Behind her, arranged in a careful semicircle, stood the warriors of the hidden band with Mado Najin at their center. Their weapons were visible but not threatening, held in positions that could shift to combat readiness in seconds if necessary. A Major Harrington, United States Cavalry, the officer called out, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet valley. I have orders to locate and recover Mr. Theodore Caldwell of the Colorado Territory Land Development Company. We have reason to believe he is being held here against his will by hostile Indians. Release him immediately and surrender yourselves for questioning. Lena stepped forward, raising her hands to show they were empty. Major, my name is Marlena Moreau. I am a United States citizen and a resident of Canyon Ridge, Colorado Territory. Mr. Caldwell is indeed here, and he is unharmed, but he is not being held against his will. He is here as a witness to crimes that reach far beyond anything you have been told in your official orders. The unexpected response clearly caught both officers off guard. Captain Morrison leaned over to whisper something urgent to Major's ear, probably reminding him that their orders made no mention of negotiating with anyone. But Harrington was a soldier who had learned to think for himself, and something in the woman's manner suggested she was telling the truth, or at least believed she was telling the truth. Where is Mr. Caldwell? The Major asked, scanning the Dakota camp for signs of their missing businessman. I need to speak with him directly to confirm his condition and circumstances. These are serious allegations you're making, miss, and they require serious evidence to support them. As if summoned by the conversation, Caldwell emerged from one of the larger lodges, his appearance so transformed that several soldiers didn't recognize him at first. Gone was the pale, soft executive in expensive clothing, replaced by a lean, sun-darkened man in practical buckskin who moved with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to live outdoors. 3 weeks in the wilderness had burned away his corporate facade, revealing something harder underneath. Hello, Morrison, Caldwell said, addressing the captain directly. I see you're still wearing that uniform I bought for you. Still taking orders from territorial headquarters instead of following your oath to protect and serve the people. How much are they paying you to ignore the systematic theft of federal lands and the murder of United States citizens? The accusation hit Captain Morrison like a physical blow, his face flushing red with anger or embarrassment, or both. Mr. Caldwell, you appear to be suffering from some form of mental distress. he said loudly, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. Perhaps the result of your captivity by these savages. We're here to rescue you and return you to proper medical care. But Major Harrington was studying Caldwell's face with the practiced eye of someone who had interrogated hundreds of witnesses over the years. This wasn't a man suffering from Stockholm Syndrome or wilderness madness. This was someone who had decided to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. Mr. Caldwell, he said carefully, are you here of your own free will, or are you being coerced in any way? I'm here because these people saved my life, Caldwell replied, his voice carrying across the valley with perfect clarity. Saved it from men I hired to commit murder. Saved it from a conspiracy I helped create. Saved it from the kind of corruption that turns soldiers into private armies for whoever pays the most money. Major, I have documents that prove systematic fraud involving millions of dollars in stolen land and dozens of murdered families. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Several of the enlisted men began muttering among themselves, recognizing the sound of truth when they heard it. These were men who had sworn oaths to defend the Constitution and protect innocent citizens, not to serve as enforcers for corrupt businessmen and politicians. Captain Morrison's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Major Harrington's sharp glance stopped him cold. The older officer understood that they had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple rescue mission, and drawing weapons would only make the situation worse. What kind of documents? He asked, his military mind already working through the implications of what he was hearing. Lena reached into her medicine bag and withdrew the carefully copied papers she had spent weeks preparing. Telegraph records showing coordination between company agents and territorial officials, she said, approaching slowly with the documents held high. Land surveys that were falsified to steal property from legitimate owners. Death certificates that were backdated to hide murders. Financial records showing bribes paid to judges, legislators, and military officers. She handed the papers to Major Harrington, who began scanning them with the methodical attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence. What he saw made his weathered face grow increasingly grim. Names he recognized, dates that corresponded to suspicious incidents he had investigated, amounts of money that explained why certain orders had come down from headquarters without proper justification. Sweet Jesus, the major whispered, his voice barely audible. Morrison, did you know about any of this? He turned to face his subordinate officer, and what he saw in the younger man's face told him everything he needed to know. Morrison's hand was now resting on his pistol grip, and his eyes held the desperate look of a cornered animal. The next few seconds stretched like hours. 60 armed soldiers facing a handful of Dakota warriors and 2 white civilians who claimed to have evidence of massive corruption involving their own chain of command. The tension was so thick it seemed to press down on everyone like a physical weight. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and the sacred valley would become a battlefield. That's when Grandmother Winona stepped forward, her ancient voice carrying the authority of someone who had negotiated with generals and chiefs, presidents and medicine men. Major Harrington, she said in perfect English, your soldiers are tired and hungry. Your horses need water and grain. Accept our hospitality while you read those papers properly. Truth requires time to be understood completely. The offer was brilliant in its simplicity, providing a face-saving way for everyone to step back from immediate violence, while giving the major time to process information that could change everything. Harrington understood the wisdom of it immediately, nodding his acceptance while keeping a careful eye on Captain Morrison, who looked ready to start shooting at any moment. Sergeant Williams, the major called to his senior non-commissioned officer, have the men water their horses and prepare a cold camp. We'll be staying here while I review these documents. Captain Morrison, you will accompany me for a private conference immediately. The tone brooked no argument, and Morrison had no choice but to follow his commanding officer toward a neutral area between the cavalry and the Dakota camp. What followed was the most important conversation of Major Harrington's career, as Morrison, faced with overwhelming evidence and no escape route, began to reveal the full extent of the conspiracy that had corrupted the territorial administration. The captain had been recruited 3 years earlier with promises of rapid promotion and lucrative post-military opportunities, gradually drawn into a web of illegal activities that had seemed harmless at first, but had steadily escalated into outright murder. It started with simple favors. Morrison confessed, his voice breaking under the weight of accumulated guilt, delaying investigations, losing paperwork, providing information about troop movements to help the company avoid military patrols. They made it seem patriotic, like we were helping develop the territory for the good of the nation. By the time I realized what we were really doing, I was in too deep to get out. The documents Lena had prepared told the complete story, from the initial land frauds through the systematic elimination of witnesses, including the names of dozens of officials who had been bought, blackmailed, or intimidated into cooperation. The conspiracy reached into every level of territorial government, federal land offices, and military commands throughout the region. It was corruption on a scale that threatened the entire structure of law and order in the Colorado Territory. As the afternoon wore on and Major Harrington continued reading, the full magnitude of what they had uncovered became clear. This wasn't just about stolen land or even murdered families. Though those crimes were serious enough, this was about the fundamental question of whether the United States would be governed by law or by the highest bidder. Whether justice was a principle or merely another commodity to be bought and sold. Meanwhile, the enlisted men had been talking among themselves, sharing stories and suspicions that suddenly made sense in light of the morning's revelations. Many of them remembered orders that had seemed strange at the time, missions that had nothing to do with military objectives, incidents where they had been told to look the other way while civilians were mistreated. The realization that they had been used as unwitting tools of oppression sat heavily on soldiers who had sworn to protect the innocent. Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran of 20 years' service, finally approached his commanding officer. "With the concerns of the enlisted men, Major," he said quietly, "the boys are asking questions about some of our previous assignments. Seems like a lot of things make more sense now than they did at the time. What are your orders, sir?" Harrington looked up from the documents that had occupied his attention for hours, his face showing the strain of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a single day. "Sergeant," he said slowly, "I believe we have been used as instruments of injustice rather than protectors of it. The question now is what we do about that knowledge." The major stood and walked to where Lena and Mato Najin were waiting beside the river. His decision made, but the consequences still unclear. "Miss Moreau," he said formally, "I believe your allegations are substantially correct. The evidence you have provided indicates criminal activity on a massive scale involving numerous territorial and federal officials, however. I am also aware that attempting to pursue justice through normal channels would likely result in the destruction of evidence and the elimination of witnesses." Lena had been expecting this moment, the point where even sympathetic officials would find reasons why justice was impossible or impractical. "Major," she said quietly, "I understand your position, but I also know that doing nothing is the same as being complicit. These documents are copies, the originals are hidden where the company can never find them. If we all die here today, the truth will still survive." Her words hung in the evening air like a challenge thrown down before the assembled soldiers. Men who had spent their careers following orders were being asked to choose between obedience and justice, between the safety of the status quo and the dangerous uncertainty of doing what was right. It was a moment that would define not just their own futures, but the future of the territory they had sworn to protect. Major Harrington looked around at his men, seeing the question in their faces, the need for leadership that went beyond military protocol. He thought about his own oath of service, about the Constitution he had sworn to defend, about the difference Between following orders and serving justice, when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Gentlemen," he announced, "it appears we have stumbled upon the crime of the century. Our duty as soldiers of the United States is clear. We will ensure that this evidence reaches officials who cannot be bought or intimidated. We will protect these witnesses until they can testify before proper authorities, and we will see justice done, regardless of who tries to stop us." The cheer that went up from the enlisted men echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. 60 soldiers who had found their honor again after unknowingly serving corruption. But even as they celebrated, everyone understood that the real battle was just beginning. The forces arrayed against them had money, connections, and power that reached to the highest levels of government. Exposing the truth would require courage, sacrifice, and more than a little luck. As night fell over the sacred valley, two very different groups of warriors prepared for the fight of their lives, not against each other as everyone had expected, but together against an enemy that threatened everything they believed in. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest. The implications of their alliance became clear as Major Harrington and his senior sergeants met with Mato, Najin, and the Dakota war chiefs around a council fire that burned late into the night. Maps were spread on buffalo hides while veteran soldiers and experienced warriors shared intelligence about the enemy they now faced together. The corruption extended far beyond the Colorado Territory, reaching into military commands, federal agencies, and political offices that could mobilize resources on a scale none of them had imagined. Sergeant Williams, whose weathered hands had held rifles in a dozen campaigns, traced supply routes on the territorial map with the careful attention of a man who understood logistics. "They'll send more troops," he said grimly. "Professional soldiers who won't ask questions about their orders. Men who've been bought or blackmailed into following commands without conscience. We're looking at a small war, Major, not just a police action." But Mato Najin had spent years studying the white man's way of making war, learning their strengths and weaknesses through careful observation and bitter experience. "They have numbers and weapons," he agreed, "but they don't know this land. They'll follow roads and establish trails, making themselves predictable. We can use their own strength against them by choosing where and when to fight." The strategic discussion continued deep into the night, revealing the depth of planning that would be required to survive what was coming. Captain Morrison, now fully committed to redemption after his confession, provided detailed information about military protocols, communication procedures, and the likely response from territorial headquarters when his unit failed to report on schedule. His knowledge of the enemy's methods would be crucial in the days ahead. "They'll declare us all rogue," Morrison explained, his voice heavy with the weight of his betrayal and his attempt at atonement. "Deserters, traitors, whatever justification they need to use overwhelming force. The newspapers will print whatever story serves their purposes, painting us as dangerous criminals who attacked federal troops. By the time anyone learns the truth, we'll be dead and buried." Lena listened to these discussions with growing understanding of the forces arrayed against them, but also with a strategic mind that had been sharpened by weeks of planning and preparation. "They're making the same mistake they made with me," she observed, assuming that violence and intimidation will solve their problems. But exposure is what they truly fear, not death. They can explain away dead bodies, but they can't explain away living witnesses with documented evidence. The conversation turned to immediate practical concerns as dawn approached. Food and ammunition, medical supplies for the wounded, secure communications with the outside world, escape routes if their position became untenable. Every detail had to be planned with military precision, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Grandmother Winona, who had remained silent through most of the tactical discussions, finally spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen many wars and understood their true cost. "You speak of battles and strategies," she said quietly, "but remember that victory means nothing if it destroys what we fight to protect. Justice without mercy becomes vengeance, and vengeance consumes those who pursue it. Her words carried weight with both the soldiers and the warriors, reminding them that their ultimate goal was not destruction, but restoration of law and order. They fought not for conquest, but for the simple right of honest people to live in peace without fear of corrupt officials and violent criminals. That distinction would be crucial in the dark days ahead, as the first light of dawn began to paint the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold. The unlikely alliance had been forged in steel and oath. 60 cavalry soldiers and 24 Dakota warriors, bound together by shared commitment to justice and mutual respect, earned through honest conversation. They would face whatever came. Together, or they would die together, but they would not compromise with corruption. The reckoning came 5 days later in the form of 300 soldiers riding hard from Fort Collins, their blue uniforms dark with sweat, and their faces grim with the kind of determination that came from orders backed by serious money. At their head rode Colonel Augustus Blackwood, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had been earned in the Indian Wars and honed through years of doing the government's dirty work without asking uncomfortable questions. Behind him came professional killers wearing cavalry uniforms, men who understood that some missions required absolute silence from all witnesses. But Lena and her unlikely alliance had not been idle during those 5 days of preparation. The Sacred Valley had been transformed into a fortress using principles that combined Dakota warfare with military engineering. Hidden rifle pits commanded every approach. Carefully constructed barriers funneled attackers into killing zones, and escape routes had been prepared should retreat become necessary. Most importantly, multiple copies of the evidence had been smuggled out by Dakota messengers who could travel unseen through country that would stop a cavalry patrol. The final battle began not with gunfire, but with words. As Colonel Blackwood approached under a white flag, carried by a nervous lieutenant who clearly understood he was riding into a potential massacre, the colonel himself showed no such concern, sitting his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient violence. His pale eyes surveyed the valley's defenses with professional appreciation, before settling on the mixed group of soldiers and warriors who awaited his ultimatum. "Major Harrington," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You and your men are in violation of direct orders from territorial headquarters. You will surrender immediately and submit to military justice, or you will be considered deserters in a time of war and dealt with accordingly. This is your only warning." Harrington stepped forward, his weathered face showing no trace of the fear that any reasonable man should feel when facing overwhelming odds. Behind him stood Lena and Mato Najin, living symbols of everything the colonel's masters wanted to destroy. "Colonel," the major replied with formal military courtesy, "I respectfully decline your demand. My oath is to the Constitution of the United States, not to corrupt politicians and their criminal allies. If you wish to take this valley, you'll have to fight for it." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a fired cannon, impossible to recall and heavy with the promise of violence. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something cold and deadly flickered behind his eyes. He had come expecting to crush a handful of rogue soldiers and their Indian allies. Instead, he found organized resistance backed by moral conviction. It was a combination that had toppled empires and broken armies throughout history. "So be it," the colonel said simply, turning his horse back toward his waiting troops. "When this is over, there will be no survivors to tell lies about what happened here. History will record that a band of renegade soldiers and hostile Indians attacked a legitimate government expedition, requiring the use of necessary force to restore order. What followed was not the quick massacre Blackwood had expected, but a carefully orchestrated demonstration of how determination and superior knowledge of terrain could neutralize numerical advantage. The first assault waves found themselves channeled into narrow approaches, where Dakota warriors picked off officers with deadly accurate rifle fire, while hidden cavalry soldiers created crossfires that turned retreat into rout. Bodies in blue uniforms began piling up at the base of carefully prepared positions. Lena fought like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, her tomahawk finding targets with mechanical precision while her rifle spoke. With the voice of frontier justice, she had been transformed by her ordeal from a simple telegraph operator into something far more dangerous. A woman who understood that some evils could only be answered with violence. Her accuracy was devastating. Each shot carefully aimed to remove officers and non-commissioned leaders who held the enemy force together. Mouto Najin moved through the battle like a force of nature, appearing where the fighting was thickest and disappearing before return. Fire could find him. His war cry echoed off the canyon walls as he led Dakota warriors in flanking attacks that hit enemy formations at their most vulnerable points. This was warfare as his ancestors had practiced it, using mobility and intimate knowledge of terrain to overcome superior numbers and firepower. But it was Major Harrington who provided the tactical leadership that turned desperate defense into systematic victory. His 30 years of military experience had taught him how armies thought and moved, how to anticipate enemy actions and counter them before they developed. Under his guidance, the Valley's defenders fought not as separate groups but as a unified force that maximized their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. The turning point came when Captain Morrison, seeking redemption for his years of corruption, led a suicide charge against the enemy command post that had been established on the Valley's eastern rim. Taking only a handful of volunteers, he fought his way through concentrated fire to reach Colonel Blackwood's position. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but decisive, ending with both officers dead but the enemy's command structure shattered beyond repair, with their leadership destroyed and their attack formations broken. Blackwood's surviving troops began to retreat in disorder, leaving behind wounded comrades and expensive equipment in their haste to escape the killing ground the Valley had become. The professional soldiers who had entered confident of easy victory fled like broken militiamen, their morale destroyed by the realization that their cause was neither just nor winnable in the aftermath of the battle. As smoke cleared from the valley floor and the wounded were tended by both sides without regard to uniform or skin color, Lena stood among the bodies of men who had died trying to preserve corruption. She felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only grim recognition that violence had been the only language their enemies understood. Justice had been served, but at a price that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A victory in the Sacred Valley proved to be the beginning rather than the end of their struggle. Word of the battle spread throughout the territory like wildfire, carried by witnesses who had seen honest soldiers and Indian warriors fighting together against government corruption. Newspapers that had been bought by corporate interests suddenly found their credibility questioned by readers who demanded the truth about what was happening in the Colorado Territory. More importantly, the evidence that Lena had so carefully preserved and distributed began to work its way through legal channels that couldn't be completely controlled by corrupt officials. Federal prosecutors in Denver, territorial judges who had maintained their integrity, and military investigators from Washington all began asking uncomfortable questions about land frauds and murdered families. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Within 6 months, the Colorado Territory Land Development Company had been dissolved and its assets seized by federal marshals. Dozens of officials faced criminal charges, while others fled to Mexico or California hoping to escape justice. The systematic theft of land that had displaced hundreds of families was reversed through court orders that restored legitimate property rights. It was not perfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless. Caldwell, whose testimony had proven crucial in unraveling the conspiracy, received a presidential pardon in recognition of his cooperation with federal investigators. He used his freedom to establish a legal aid society that helped displaced families recover their stolen land. Spending the rest of his life trying to atone for the crimes he had enabled, it was a small redemption, but perhaps enough to balance the scales of his personal accounting with justice. Major Harrington was promoted to colonel and assigned to head a new military unit tasked with investigating corruption within territorial governments. His success in the Colorado Territory had proven that honest soldiers could make a difference when they chose duty over convenience. The unit he commanded became a model for military integrity that served the nation well in the years that followed. Sergeant Williams and the enlisted men who had fought in the Sacred Valley were decorated for valor and offered positions in Harrington's new command. Most accepted, having discovered that serving justice was more satisfying than following orders. Without question, they became the core of a military force that could not be bought, intimidated, or corrupted by political pressure. The Dakota band that had sheltered Lena and provided sanctuary for the forces of justice was granted federal recognition and protection for their Sacred Valley. Grandmother Winona lived to see her people's rights respected by the same government that had tried to destroy them. It was a small victory in the larger struggle for Indian rights, but it proved that justice was possible when honest people stood together regardless of their differences. Mato Najin was offered a commission in the United States Army, but declined in favor of serving as a liaison between military forces and tribal governments. His work helped prevent dozens of potential conflicts by ensuring that both sides understood each other's perspectives and intentions. He became a bridge between two worlds that had been separated by misunderstanding and mistrust for too long. But it was Lena's transformation that proved most remarkable. The woman who had begun as a simple telegraph operator became a symbol of resistance against government corruption throughout the American West. She testified before congressional committees, wrote articles for national magazines, and spoke at public gatherings where her story inspired others to stand up against injustice in their own communities. 5 years after the battle in the Sacred Valley, Lena returned to the place where her ordeal had begun. Canyon Ridge had been transformed from a struggling frontier town into a prosperous community, where honest business flourished under the protection of incorruptible law enforcement. The telegraph office where she had once worked now bore a bronze plaque commemorating her courage in exposing the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the territory. She married Mato Najin in a ceremony that combined Dakota traditions with Christian customs, their union symbolizing the possibility of different peoples finding common ground in shared values of justice and mutual respect. Together, they established a ranch in the foothills of the Colorado Rockies, raising cattle and children while maintaining their commitment to fighting corruption wherever it appeared. Their children grew up learning both Dakota and English, understanding that they carried the blood and traditions of two peoples who had found a way to live in harmony. The lessons of the Sacred Valley were passed down through family stories that emphasized the importance of standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Each new generation learned that justice was not something that could be taken for granted, but required constant vigilance to preserve. The ranch became a gathering place for people from all walks of life, who shared a commitment to honest government and fair treatment for all citizens. Former soldiers, Dakota warriors, reformed politicians, honest businessmen, and ordinary families all found welcome at the table where Lena and Mato Najin served meals and shared stories of their struggle against corruption. It was a living reminder that different people could work together when they shared common values. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Lena would sometimes stand on her front porch looking west toward the mountains, where the Sacred Valley lay hidden among the red stone canyons. She remembered the woman she had been before Buck Torino's chains, remembered the fear and helplessness that had nearly destroyed her spirit, remembered the moment when Mato Najin stepped from the forest to change everything. But mostly she remembered the lesson that had emerged from her suffering, that justice was not something that happened by accident or was granted by authorities, but was something that had to be fought for by ordinary people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The chains that had nearly killed her had been broken not by rescue, but by her own decision to fight back. The real victory had not been in the battle, but in the choice to resist. The story of Lena Moreau and Mato Najin became legend throughout the American West, told around campfires and in saloons, passed down through family histories and newspaper accounts. It was a story that reminded people that corruption could be defeated when honest individuals had the courage to stand together. That justice was always possible for those willing to fight for it. That even the most powerful enemies could be overcome by truth and determination. Years later, when historians studied the period of territorial expansion and asked how the American West avoided becoming a lawless wasteland controlled by corporate interests and corrupt politicians, they inevitably returned to the battle in the Sacred Valley. It had been a small engagement involving relatively few people, but its impact had resonated throughout the region and beyond, proving that individual courage could change the course of history when it was backed by unwavering commitment to justice. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that ordinary people had the power to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as the natural order of things. Lena had been dragged behind a wagon in chains, broken and bleeding, seemingly powerless against forces too large and corrupt to resist. But she had survived, she had fought back, and she had won not just her own freedom, but justice for countless others who had been victimized by the same system. The chains had been meant to break her spirit, but they had forged her into something stronger than steel, something that could not be bought, intimidated, or destroyed by any force on earth. She had become justice itself, walking upright in a land where truth was finally free to flourish under the protection of honest law and the eternal vigilance of those who refused to let freedom die.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.